killed in World War II in the concentration camps. He was smuggled out, and it's supposed to have been a miracle how he was smuggled out and made his way to Palestine. The story is that, I was told by one of my teachers, is that after the Nazis invaded Poland, one of his students started driving him out, and they got stopped at roadblocks the day after the invasion, and he handed them a shopping list, and they looked at the shopping list and waved him through until he was able to get to out of there. So that's the story, and people say it's accurate that they spoke to him. And when I met him, it was 1966. He was already in his 90s. Some people say he was 92. Something. I don't even know if he knew. And you had to be a physical fit to get to see him, because there were so many people who wanted to get in. You had to get there hours before. Not as and people would hit, literally punch. And you had to be in like this just to get in, because there's at least 150 people in a room probably this size. And so you had to work for it. So when after I studied that, and he went over how things become manifest, and I looked around the world, and there was wars and suffering and pain and all that sort of thing. I said, and talked about the Ari, which he wasn't a Lurianic Kabbalist. And Isaac Luria was in Spot in the 16th century, and he talked about the broken vessels. And he, that I was up there, and I was meditating, and I think, well, how do you repair? And that became a 35-year quest for me. And I realized it had to be reverse engineered, and I got piece by piece. One of them was when I was in New York, when His Holiness was teaching the 7-point mind treating, which he ended up not teaching, which he went into an academic dissertation of all the schools from 4,000 years ago up until the MIT and Wisconsin training, and left out the mind training. And he said, all you need to know is 2 sentences. He said, give all blame for the original cause, which is separation, and contemplate the kindness of all sentient beings. He said, the rest is just, explanations of those two. And I sat through, every school, he went for 4 days. And it was literally like a professor going through every level. But you went a little bit yesterday, I think, when we were there. You mentioned the sun, which is the non-creator and the creator. And, but anyway, so I was up there, and I thought, how do we repair? And it became obvious to me there had to be a direction of repair. It's not, you don't just put things back together. And obviously things were broken, but they could be broken so bad because there was still a world here.
Can you say anything about what he just said about the creator and the non-creator, and how that's related to Ayin or Ein Sof? Or is it?
Well, in Kabbalah, they take it for granted that creation comes from a realm of that's God. And the deeper you get into Kabbalah, our concept of God is not the one that they're talking about.
Who's that?
The Kabbalists. So, and I understand that the idea of a creator in Buddhism is that any God that is created is a product of our own minds. So basically, I think they're all saying the same thing in a different way.
The problem is the concept.
Yeah. And the Ayin teachings, which I one day would like to do with people, but I got to be sure we know what we're doing, is that you're really dealing with, and you're not dealing with nothingness. You're not dealing with God. And but some of the deeper teachings, which I promised you some material I've never taught before, I'm just going to give you a hint, is that some of the deeper teachings that the way back home is through the Ayin, which is non-existence, which again is not a good way of describing it. So there are Ayin meditations that were taught. And the medicine making was, the original homeopathic medicines went through a mathematical formula to make them into the alchemical medicines into homeopathic medicines. And basically the mathematical formula was the tree of life. So if those of you that mixed medicines notice that it was 7 minutes mixing and 3 minutes scraping. 7 would be for these spheroids, and the 3 is by reflection. So the scraping is getting the scraps from the reflection, and the mixing was remixing our patterns that have caused us suffering and torment. And then they would go through the 4 worlds until you journeyed back up to the spiritual world. And the Kabbalah said that a drive to incarnate is driven always by a question, and the question is always not personal, it's universal. And that the answer to the question is the way our life unfolds, and that if we answer it, it gets incorporated into an evolving consciousness that perpetuates more creation. Okay? So when we come down to the physical world, in the healing process is how do we, if we're broken and we're shattered, what kind of process do we go through to heal? And in the physical world, it encompasses the opposite of what's in the doing world, which is the world of accomplishment, of making something out of your life, or growing a garden, teaching people, evolving. And healing, the physical world, which is reverse, is all non-doing. So it actually becomes the world of being. And to get to that stage of non-doing, you have to work through the concept of impermanence, that nothing ever stays the same, and be okay with that. That whenever you think you have something, you're going to lose it because it's going to change. The next step is that everything will die that we know, and that the only thing we can't predict is the time of our death, and that we're subject to permanence and death, and that we have to work through our ignorances. And the main Kabbalistic ignorance was thinking that in this world that we are the experience, which I mentioned before. That we're not here, we're here to evolve into and result into an evolving, elegant consciousness, but we are not from this world. We hijacked this experience. We're from somewhere else. So there was 2 evolutions going on. There's this own evolution, and somehow we decided that this was an opportune place to bring spiritual possibilities into a physical experience, and it had to go through this process to individuate and activate or actualize.
Well, why do you say hijacking? Why wasn't it supposed to be? Or else what was here that was displaced? Why do you say hijack?
Well, what the Kabbalists would say is that this world existed before we came in this world. Hijack is my word. So
that implies some kind of hostile takeover.
No, it's not, they didn't mean hostile. They meant that there was a place for us to activate its spiritual potential into a physical form, which would mean that it would be an individual form. That you'd have to have physical to individuate the experience.
There's no intent of conscience taking over this realm.
No, it's not hostile.
Ken?
Question.
Thanks for clarifying, because that's not what I meant.
So,
Introduce yourself, you don't want to have it.
I'm David. I'm like 40 days and 40 nights guy after calling from last week. So, where does the whole biologic and genetic evolutionary process that is, to my mind, I mean, I certainly accept it as forming the reality that I'm living right
Right.
now. I mean, I believe that my genes have been evolving for millions, if not billions of years, and at some point these genes were in a four-legged creature, and that's all still in me.
All that is happening, it's a great question, is all that's happening here. And when they meant is that we're broader than that we come from over here and descend here. So, but the whole experience of the genetics and genes, well, some of it would actually be in this level also, in the biochemical level. But the expression of the genes would be down there.
And to my mind, sort of what I perceive as my consciousness, that's also an evolutionary outcome of, a certain part of my brain that developed that didn't used to be there, the different parts of the cortex.
Well, they would argue that that's limited consciousness, that the universal consciousness is beyond your brain. So that's a whole different discussion, but they would differentiate between what your brain is producing and what higher consciousness is producing. So, but everything is taking place within here, at that level. So the third thing is overcoming our ignorances, because as we go through life, we learn things, and then we assume those things are true, and then we keep repeating them over and over again, and then we get stuck here, and one of them is the ignorance that this is all there is. And it ends here and begins here. And the Kabbalists would argue that that's just ignorance. And then the fourth level is, some people call it karma, cause and effect. The Kabbalists talked about our habits and we talked about earlier, we had a conversation with where our habits become from the survival mechanism, that if you want to survive in the physical realm, there's certain rules if you don't want to be eaten. And so behaviors that keep you from being somebody's dinner are repeated over and over again in the brain. And the Kabbalists would argue that getting stuck just on that level of consciousness would prevent the healing process to take place, and for you to actualize your life. And they argued that the purpose of our life is to be ourselves, and to be ourselves we have to authenticate ourselves by expressing something that never was expressed before and never will be, and therefore the preciousness of life. And therefore any rule that saves a life, any religious rule, can be ignored if a life is at stake. Because the preciousness of life is an opportunity for something that's overcome impossible odds to have an opportunity to express itself. And so that anybody that has this opportunity to embody that should cherish even their pain and suffering. And one of the great Kabbalists, and he was a doctor and a spiritual teacher, Nachman of Breslov, his students wrote down a teaching he gave after his firstborn son died. The next day he gave a teaching called the Garden of the Souls, and said that this level, Malchut, is really a garden, and that the suffering and pain that's part of the garden is really the fertilizer. And that we can't access the whole truth. All our things that we complain about, we would celebrate if we understood the ramifications of this opportunity. And that this opportunity, no matter how bad it gets, should be cherished and not ignored. So those are the four major categories of healing of the first thing. And then we go back up. So this is non-doing. So the Kabbalists would maintain that at the level of non-doing is where healing begins. Okay?
So you said Malkut is the garden of what?
Garden of the Souls.
Of the souls, okay. So why of the souls when we're in physical form there?
That was last week's lesson, but
Huh?
I'll explain it again, because that wasn't really part of what I was teaching. But in Kabbalistic terms, the basic Kabbalah, not Lurianic Kabbalah, there's three souls, and there's the Nefesh, is the one that exists in the physical form, and it dies when our physical body dies. And then there's the ruach, which some people would call the repository, or the cellular memory, or the records, and that exists on this level, part of the emotional, part of the mental realm, and that one exists through lifetimes or other forms of existence, and it retains all the memory. And then there's the higher soul that had a contracted Tzimtzum that exists up here, and that's who our true identity is, and that one never changes.
What's the name of that one?
Neshama.
How do you spell that?
N-E-S-H-A.
that, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so that would be up here, and then you'd have Ruach over here, and then you have Nefesh over here. So what Nachman of Bratslav argued was you're growing Nefesh, and then how the Nefesh will accomplish it, will deposit it into the Ruach.
So the higher level, these